Abibi Fahudiye and blessings to the ancestors. It's Deshaun here with a new video series called Blacklash, where I'll be discussing the agenda of an organization I'm in the process of forming called the Original People's Party, or OPP for short, which is a Pan-Africanist organization that intends to provide and execute solutions to our problems as African people in the motherland through our development strategy. From my point of view, the dire conditions which we find ourselves as African people across the motherland and in the diaspora over the last 500 years and in contemporary times are due to a lack of power to change or improve our material conditions due to enslavement, colonialism, and neo-colonial forms of exploitation. Over the last few years, I've been studying to define what power looks like for us as African people, and the necessary work involved in developing and actualizing that power, and what would that power would look like in tangible and intangible forms. The conclusion I've come to is that ultimately, economics, or more specifically, industrial power, is the root of the foundation for us to develop not only the life essentials we need for survival, such as food and medical care, to basic consumer goods, but also the technical aspect that will provide future collective security for the race within our respective areas, with a particular focus on the motherland. This Blacklash series will be dedicated to demonstrating my argument for economic development through industrialization, using historical literature from my own studies to prove why the OPP agenda will be the correct solution and pathway to achieve our long-term goals as an organization. Included in this series, we will also touch upon the ideological fundamentals of our interpretation of Pan-Africanism through a race-first and nationalist outlook, and also go in depth into security issues related to intelligence, infiltration, and covert operations, which we will likely have to contend with by using historical and contemporary examples that will determine the success of our future development plans. The objective of this video series is to help promote the OPP agenda and attract those who are interested in supporting or becoming an active future member. So please like, comment, subscribe, and share these videos, because this takes time-consuming work to research and produce these videos, along with myself working full-time. I'm very passionate about presenting and executing these solutions I'm offering for us as African people, and cannot do without your support. With that being said, thank you, and let's get started with today's video. To start, let me describe the importance of industrialization as a key objective for OPP and its potential impact on human societies. By reorganizing labor through our cooperative concept, the training of labor, along with the creation of supply chains and being tied together with our own currency, will enable us to produce the essential and basic goods that we typically consume through the existing capitalist and neo-colonial economy. The reason why this is important is because this complex dynamic I just explained is what creates and organizes an economy that not only prices and provides what a society needs or consumes, but also the jobs and the relevant taxes contributed that allows members of societies and workers to purchase those produced goods. Contemporarily, this is clearly not the type of power that we as African people currently have due to the historical problems mentioned before, as we've seen persistent poverty and exploitation in the majority of the motherland and the diaspora. The groups of people who has been able to benefit from Africa's underdevelopment and have been able to, over the last 500 years, reorganize their backward feudal societies into efficient capitalist systems that effectively exploited the resources of Africa and the global south through the ability of industrial development, which I will describe coming up next. In the aftermath of the fall of the Holy Roman Empire and the devastation of the Black Plague, Europe entered its quote-unquote Renaissance period in the 14th and 15th centuries, looking to explore for gold, natural resources, and conquer more lands for its feudal nobles and starving population. To kickstart this process, the Portuguese and the Spanish were among the first Europeans, with the permission of the Pope and the Catholic Church, to explore the unknown world for new areas to exploit and profit. This led to several incursions along the west coast and southern Africa, and many attempts to build trading posts along the seaboard. Coinciding with these incursions, the discovery of the Western Hemisphere by the Spanish and Portuguese led to the increased demand of African slaves to ship to and work these new Western lands for profit due to African ability to withstand the tropical and disease-ridden environment that the colonists were not yet immune to. As European incursions occurred over the next several centuries, the Atlantic slave trade grew as the demand expanded not only the trade of African peoples, but also led to the access of the African interior and her future resources. This leads us to the key premise of my argument of this video regarding industrialization and Africa's role in contributing to Europe's development. It is my view that the slave trade, coinciding with the Europeans' ongoing wars against African kingdoms and nations between the 15th and 19th century, is that the gradual inroads that Europeans made setting up trade posts along the African coast led to the exploration and eventual discoveries of the key mechanism that would fuel Europe's development, which is raw materials. I will make this point clearer in a few, but allow me to first define what raw materials and the purpose it serves in production and industrialization. Raw materials, or better known as natural resources, are tangible items or objects that are usually found within the natural environment of a given area, typically underground through mining. For a common modern example, oil and gas can be considered a raw material, as typically they're mined underground below the Earth's surface. Extracted through science and machine technology, it is then converted from its crude form into common uses such as fuel for transportation, such as cars, shipping, flights, air travel, etc. that provides heat, or basic goods such as plastic or petrochemicals, which is used to produce textile, clothing, and shoes. With my working definition, it is my view that on the onset of the slave trade and the European presence on the continent, wars and eventual settlement in friendly allied African territories is what fueled Europe's industrial development. Western Europe was not a region endowed with agricultural lands and natural resources unlike its Russian counterparts in the East to extract and produce raw materials self-sufficiently. However, as Europeans explored and invaded places such as Africa and Asia, these incursions gave them access to these strategic raw materials. For example, in an article by the Center for Economic Policy Research, it summarizes the initial stages of trade Europeans engaged with Africans for African slaves and the subsequent impact that would have on its industrial development by stating,
revolutions in transportation, railways, steamships, a move towards liberal trade policies in Europe, and increasing rates of GDP growth enhanced demand for new manufactures, raw materials and tropical cash crops. African producers responded to this demand by increasing exports of vegetable oils, palm oil, groundnuts, gum, ivory, gold, hides and skins. Palm oil, a key export, was highly valued as a lubricant for machinery and an ingredient in food and soap. During and after the scramble, the range of commodity exports broadened to include raw materials like rubber, cotton, and copper, as well as cash crops such as cocoa, coffee, tea, and tobacco. The lion's share of these commodities went directly to manufacturing firms and consumers in Europe.
Over time, however, as I theorized, European settlement and exploration of the African interior beyond the coast led to the key discovery of essential raw materials needed for industrialization as alluded to in the prior quote. A short list of examples of these materials includes various ores such as tin, zinc, bauxite, and manganese, which is used in the conversion of iron and steel, and other resources such as aluminum, which is converted to construct machines and equipment used in industrial development in combination with those resources previously mentioned. Evidence to support my view comes from one of our most honorable ancestors, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's work, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. In his book, Nkrumah described in detail the matured stages of Western capitalist various interests across the continent and the aforementioned raw material-based industries which Western capital was in control over or invested in at the time of the book's writing in 1965, which he will demonstrate the conditions of the neo-colonial relationship hasn't changed till this day. During the period of emerging independent African countries breaking exchange from former Western colonialism, Nkrumah described as the neo-colonial dynamic of Western power still maintaining control over Africa's resources in the following short excerpts. The first example is seen in the West African region regarding Gabon, as Nkrumah explains.
Comolog, a French mining company, exploits Gabon's manganese, iron/steel deposits in collaboration with U.S. Steel, the American steel firm, controlled by J.P. Morgan interests. Together with its affiliates, U.S. Steel has 49% control of Comolog, with French monopolists as the chief partners to Comolog.
This aspect is repeated throughout the chapter in relation to Guinea's bauxite reserves and Western capital collaborating to exploit it. The next example is seen in relation to Southern Africa, with Nkrumah describing the industrial relationship between the United States and British interests, stating,
The Anglo-American Corporation Ltd. invests principal in mining, nevertheless branch out into processing, transport of timber, industry, hydroelectrical power scheme like that of the Rhodesia-Congo Border Power Corporations, with interest in gold, uranium, iron, copper, asbestos, and coal mines. The company was incorporated in 1917 to draw together a number of mining, investment, and industrial companies already controlled by Harry Oppenheimer to bring them into tighter organization. As the guardian of this interest, Anglo-American acts as a technical manager and secretary to an extensive number of companies falling within its wide perimeter.
In sum, Nkrumah's argument throughout his book, it is clearly demonstrated with the ongoing modern exploitation of Africa's resources by its former colonizers in Western Africa, with France's corporations, Arriva, and many others controlling vast deposits of the region's resources from uranium, bauxite, to Anglo-American interests that is still in existence today. Therefore, it would not be a far-fetched theory that the origin of these matured industries described by Nkrumah got their infant start during the initial invasions and competition amongst European capitalists between the 16th and 19th century. The end result led to the decrease of poverty in the Western world and increased standards of living through the industrialization with using these raw materials, and also conversely led to the gradual exploitation and underdevelopment and disunity of the motherland, as will be seen by the end of the 19th century. Initially, African kingdoms were able to resist and fight off European intruders due to having comparatively similar modes of production and military power and access to develop and use weapons in warfare during the early stages of European invasions. African depopulation due to the slave trade, which Africa lost many of its human capital, and the collaboration of rivaling African kingdoms and neighbors with the Europeans who participated in the slave raiding and trading of African flesh, brought about European eventual victory in the war against the continent, which those same collaborators will succumb to as well. The factors that contributed to this, in my view, starting with the access to the African interior and the eventual discovery and exploitation of its raw materials, set the stages for Europe's industrial development. This will lead to the improvement of not only European industrial production of common goods used in the exchange and trade of slaves, and will lead to the scientific discovery of new labor-saving technological processes, some of which include the steam engine, which powered earlier production mills, and the transition to internal combustion engines, which will ultimately power and boost the manufacturing and productive capabilities of Europe's factories, ships, railways, automobiles, and other key fields, using the aforementioned raw materials as described before. One of these key fields where this is exemplified is seen in warfare. The historian Philip Curtin reflects my point through his observation and the eventual culmination and the consequence of this European industrial development process, stating,
Iron metallurgy made revolutionary strides during the second half of the 19th century. The earliest form of usable iron was wrought iron, and relatively soft, malleable, easily shaped, but also relatively expensive to make up to the 19th century to convert pig iron into either wrought iron or steel. The breakthrough to cheaper high-quality iron products came in a series of new inventions of the 1860s and 1870s. The Bessemer converter could change pig into wrought iron at a fraction of the former cost. The Siemens-Martin process made it possible to do the same at even lower fuel costs, thus making the basic process of steel making possible to use with easily available phosphoric ores, ultimately lowering the cost of production in steel, replacing iron for industrial use in railways, shipbuilding, and construction. Africa felt the impact as a new supply of better and cheaper weapons became available to Europeans and their African allies. Firearms technology had been comparatively stable during the 18th century, with the standard infantry weapon being the weaker flint musket, which was widely available in Africa.
As Curtin will continue to explain, these inventions brought rifles into general use, which improved its loading ability, and second was the percussion cap, which led to more powerful breech-loading rifles and newer forms of weapons such as the Gatling or Maxim machine guns that outpaced Africa's ability to produce or obtain them. In sum, this will lead to the ultimate conquest of the motherland and will result in a current neo-colonial dynamic that extends beyond the end of formal colonialism. To further strengthen my argument, let's use a contemporary example of the recent impact of industrialization on societies using Asia. Since the start of the 21st century, Asia has become the industrial center of the world, with China leading the way by producing low-cost goods and inputs for the global economy, thus becoming the essential supply chain hub due to Western deindustrialization through neoliberalism. This has led to the decrease in impoverishment of Asia and improved the standards of living, whose nations has found better prosperity in replacing Western workers as cheap labor inputs or suppliers for products that would inevitably land in Western markets. The following comments I will be making is centered around China and display their similar paths of development as the West to further support my argument for industrialization. China and Asia in general are not resource-deprived regions naturally as compared with Western Europe. Asian countries such as China does possess natural resources within their own borders that can be used for domestic industry, but as will be explained shortly, China sources its raw materials in the same place as the West did several centuries prior. For China to reach its present industrial output as the world's manufacturing workshop, it sources the majority of its raw materials in African countries. Dating as early as back as the 1990s, Chinese industry invested billions of capital across the motherland in mining areas in order to get access to Africa's resources. As explained in an article by the Institute of Developing Economies, it states,
in the case of minerals, China is almost exclusively reliant on southern Saharan Africa for its cobalt imports, and significantly reliant for manganese, the latter primarily from Gabon, South Africa and Ghana. Southern Saharan Africa is also an important supplier of timber, mainly from Gabon, Republic of Congo, and Cameroon, and chromium, mainly from South Africa, Madagascar, and Sudan, accounting for around 1/7 of China's global imports each.
In exchange for building key infrastructure such as roads and airports, China has been able to get access to these strategic raw materials that feeds its domestic industry that allows them to produce and manufacture the industrial machines or basic consumer goods such as textiles and electronics that will be eventually used in trade or infrastructure projects such as the Belt and Road Initiative. This proves my thesis correct as Chinese development mirrored the similar pattern of Western development as described earlier, albeit with the less burden on the vestiges of former colonialism and direct imperialism, thus allowing China the ability to lift millions of its poor out of poverty and address their society's material conditions. In conclusion, hopefully I've articulated my argument well for why industrialization is the key for our OPP development program. If we as a race don't reorganize ourselves economically to meet the material needs of our people, it is my view we as African people will be destined to repeat the dysfunctional cycle designed by our Western enemies and will subject our future development to the ongoing poverty and underdevelopment again and again and again. Ultimately, it is in my view that these are the fundamental blocks of building collective power for us to be in the position to build true sovereignty as African people. And in subsequent videos, I will demonstrate this process of development step by step. With that being said, I hope we have your support as we endeavor on this path of redemption and create a better future for our people. Until next time, Abibi Fahurie and blessings to the ancestors.
We've been misled by our leadership, for instance. They think that we can consume our way into equality and sees equality as an equality of materials. So if I have the same car as a white person, if I have the same house as a white person, you know, a similar job, then I'm equal. But you cannot consume yourself into equality. You must produce yourself into equality, and you move into equality and beyond by productive thinking. Because as long as you're consuming knowledge or you're consuming materials, the guy who is giving it to you or selling it to you is producing at the same time, which means that you never catch up with him because he's always 2 or 3 steps ahead of you. To a good extent, many of our students go into schools, college as well as secondary levels, consuming, and their minds are not being developed to produce the true means by which they will accomplish equality. Everything else is sham.